After the Second World War, many research and weaponry experiments were conducted throughout the lands of the USSR. One of such experiments led to the discovery of an unknown matter, later called Miriam, as it was found in the city of Mirny 13. After a decade of study, all the matter suddenly became activated by a nuclear explosion at a nearby training facility in Ezegir. This activation caused a series of gravitational anomalies. The civilians of Mirny were evacuated and all roads were cornered off. Military recon squads arrived for further rescue and investigation missions. They discovered a rift that took them to another dimension. Within that dimension, many horrific discoveries were made. Outside, the landscape was distorted, and high levels of radiation, probably from the Miriam matter, was measured. On top of that, there were also encounters with unknown hostile armored vehicles. Even inside the tanks of the recon squads, it wasn't truly safe. Personnel became affected by the Miriam matter after too long of an exposure. This became very apparent with Captain Novak. Captain Martin Novak, a highly skilled tanker, was among the first squads that entered Mirny after the anomaly. However, he was the only one of his squad that returned in a devastating state. He showed symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder and experienced notable psychological distress, which manifested in a lack of contact with others. Only shortly after, bouts of delirium and panic attacks were recorded. Because of that, he underwent more intense medical treatment according to protocol. During this treatment, he came into contact with senior researcher Hope and showed noticeable improvements to his condition after her visits. When communicating with Hope, he was able to hold a conversation and retold the nightmarish details of the anomaly zone operation. Eventually, Martin fully recovered after just 11 days of therapy. He asked to be declared fit to continue service and had a strong desire to return to the combat missions in the anomaly zone. This struck the medical staff as odd, since, with the state he exited the zone, it was believed that his conscious, or even subconscious, wouldn't permit him to return. Despite of that, he was allowed to be readmitted to military service and operation in the anomaly zone because of his vast experience with the operation. Nevertheless, it was still recommended to monitor his medical and psychological state. Meanwhile, after the successful recovery of Martin, Hope became very optimistic about curing other returned personnel afflicted by the Miriam. She studied these personnel further to get a better understanding of the matter. They could all communicate properly with her and explained that something has changed in them, but they can only describe it as hearing whispers, but not being able to make out the words. They have trouble focusing, and when alone, they often felt like someone else was around. Personnel that had the most contact with the Miriam substance tipped into delirium and couldn't clearly articulate their thoughts. However, when given a sketchbook and pen, they were all able to draw the same images: rifts, Magnus, and a huge, distorted tank. This tank was one of the hostile vehicles that were encountered which caused the most devastation. The vehicle with the codename the Immortal. During the active fight against the Immortal, more and more hostile vehicles were encountered. After a while, even vehicles that seemed familiar. And when more intelligence was gathered, the horrific discovery was made that those vehicles were the ones of those that didn't return. These vehicles got the codename The Lost and got the secondary attention within the operation after the attempts to defeat the Immortal. Hope is happy that they are alive and describes their state as the same delirium as the personnel back at the headquarters have who had the most contact with Miriam. She is convinced that they can be saved, with the backed up evidence that her voice acted as a stimulus to the personnel who returned from Mirny. Another experiment started using Hope's voice over loudspeakers within the first phase of the anomaly zone to guide the lost to find their way out. Under the lead of recently recovered Captain Novak, the practical application to return the lost personnel started. The lost personnel reacted to Hope's voice and moved towards the loudspeakers. However, with Novak and his squad still present, the lost encircled them. Having a bad feeling about the situation and wanting to avoid to lose his squad once again, Novak made the harsh call to neutralize the threat that the lost were seemingly imposing upon his squad. However, this caused a huge conflict between Hope and Novak after his return from Mirny. Hope can't believe that Novak called the lost a threat, because they are people, alive, and can still be saved, in which Novak responded coldly, with her not understanding how dangerous the rift is, that it's expanding, and that they have to close it, no matter what, even if the lost are standing in their way. As tensions were growing, changes in Captain Novak's mental states were becoming more apparent. During his expeditions, he became increasingly cruel and began to grow a pattern of aggression. Even fellow officers noted his increased tendency to ignore orders and exercise his own judgment, which exposes personnel to unnecessary risks. These changes are concluded to be caused by severe stress and operating in a high-risk area rather than exposure to Miriam. Right before the final encounter with the Immortal, he was removed from participation in expeditions and was undergoing long-term rehabilitation. During this time, even Hope had to take more risks, endangering personnel of the recon squads in order to turn the tide against the Immortal. Eventually she succeeded, and with her findings, the weakness of the Immortal was exposed. And eventually it was destroyed, with the rift now closed. After the closure of the rift, much of the military presence, along with Colonel Gromov as the leader of the recon operations, left Mirny, leaving only a few tank squads along with the research team behind. As the study of the now less hostile environment of Mirny continued, staff members became worried as they realized that everyone that came into contact with Miriam can get influenced by it, thinking that only military personnel was affected because they entered the territory with high risk levels of Miriam radiation, and for them to be safe outside of its territory became a lesser accepted conclusion. It became more like a delusion. Hope became aware that the Miriam also influenced her already to a high degree and took drastic steps. In order to end the influence of Miriam, she dedicated herself to serve its primary request, to be returned to its home. With her knowledge about the material and the Magnus Collector, she disassociated herself from the other personnel by reopening the rift and venturing in alone. Within the reopened anomaly zone, she tried to give orders to the lost with her voice to return the final amounts of Miriam to the original deposits. However, even though the lost listened to her voice, they couldn't understand her, leading to her attempts being a most likely failure. Nevertheless, she kept trying, thinking this is the only way to stop it. The military already brushed her off. They didn't want to understand. They only saw Miriam as an enemy and not as the lost entity that accidentally came into our world. If they continued with that mentality, the circle of violence would continue as the Miriam copied the corrupted nature of the military, and armored tanks would be met with more armored tanks. Even Novak couldn't withstand it. In the end, Hope became more and more determined to conclude the conflict before the army would be back to send in more personnel that would either die or would become more of the lost. Back at headquarters, the reopening of the rift was quickly noticed, and a squad under the command of Captain Novak was deployed to the location to handle the emergency, despite still undergoing much needed rehabilitation. He knew that Hope had fled through the rift, and was persistently trying to find her. In a speech, he attends to his personnel to reach the lowest phase as quickly as possible, find hope and liquidate the consequences. In an attempt to deter Novak, Hope recreated a new incarnation of the Immortal, one that she took from the vision of his nightmares that he shared with her. However, Novak, too obsessed with his mission, rejected his fears and charged in without any hope. His obsession overcame his own person once more, since it already happened before, because his first expedition left a far bigger mental scar than first was expected. During that mission, no one knew about Miriam. When the fights began, one by one, he lost contact with his comrades. Martin didn't think about himself, he just wanted to protect his platoon and bring everyone back home. He would charge his enemies, destroying them, and immediately switch to the next, until there was no one left. When the battle ends, the visibility was improved. Martin began inspecting the wrecks, looking for his comrades. Eventually he found them, and by the looks of the impact, he realized that he was the one who destroyed them. After that, he never forgave himself and became obsessed with the idea of stopping the Miriam and closing the rift. But it only made things worse. Instead of becoming one of the lost himself, he became something else. Something worse. Corrupted. The more he fought the Miriam, the faster it turned him. He no longer could hear Hope anymore. As his mind deteriorated, he somehow gained control over the new nightmare immortal incarnation and manifested himself upon it. He kept moving forward, without looking back, without sparing anyone, mindless of any losses and casualties. Eventually, the additional tank platoons, led by experienced commanders that were formed to search for the now missing captain, were able to defeat his new nightmare form. And with the Miriam that he was able to accumulate over his rampage, Hope was able to end the crisis and return the commanders back home. In her last act, however, she announced that she would stay behind for the lost. Although she can't bring them home, she hoped to give them comfort. To hear and follow her voice, they might feel better, and she as well, being finally listened to. The true nature of Miriam can never be understood. It's from another world. We only see its reflection. It's like a mirror, neither good nor bad. Wrath, fear, fury. Miriam simply reflects the dark sides of human nature that it encountered. We got back what we gave it, and in the end, it was Novak himself that created the new immortal. With the final amount of Miriam collected, it unleashed an outbreak of unidentified energy in the center of Mirny 13, accompanied by a flash of bright light. It disabled all equipment within a 10-kilometer radius, the flash even visible from distant checkpoints. More squads were sent in to scout the place out. However, according to aerial footage, the city no longer exists. A huge crater, the only thing that was left in its place. Everyone who was still in the perimeter is considered missing. But there are no traces of Miriam activity and no evidence of any new rifts being formed. Now the area has been cornered off in a 40-kilometer radius and under constant surveillance. Amid the chaos after Mirny 13 was liquidated, all significant samples disappeared. Only a few objects from the area that still contain little amounts of the matter were collected. All of those materials related to the events of Mirny 13 are quarantined for further scientific research and must be classified.